This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As we turn now to the controversy about the comments of former House Speaker Newt Gingrich, who says that one needs to turn to, quote, Kenyan anti-colonial behavior in order to understand President Obama. In an interview with the National Review, Gingrich said it was, quote, the most accurate predictive model for his behavior. While Gingrich is coming under fire from many Democrats for his comments, we thought we'd turn to a Kenyan who is well known as an anti-colonialist. Earlier this year, I spoke with the great Kenyan writer and activist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He's a world-renowned novelist, playwright, literary critic, distinguished professor of English and comparative literature at the University of California, Irvine. Ngugi's latest book is a memoir about Kenya's anti-colonial movement, his own childhood. It's called Dreams in a Time of War.
Kenya is in East Africa, and it was a British colonial state, colonized by the British about 1895, and then getting its independence in 1963. In between those two dates, where, of course, the story of colonialism in Kenya and colonial suppression of African people in Kenya, because Kenya was also a British settler colony, because there are two types of colonies in Africa. The settler colony like Kenya, South Africa, where a sizable European population settled there, and the more protectorate type like Nigeria and Uganda. The problem with a settler state, as opposed to the other type, was, of course, extreme racism. So that for society in settler Kenya, colonial settler Kenya, was Europeans. Imagine a pyramid. The Europeans were at the top of the pyramid, the Asian community in the middle, and the African people formed the base of that entire, structure. So, in fact, like South Africa, we had a system of, particularly during the fight against the British, an African could not move from A to B without a passport, without identification papers, and so on. So, very many things were stuck against African people during that period of 1895 and 1963. But the most interesting for us as colonial settler colony was the issue of land, because wherever there was the difference between a settler colony and the other type of colony is the issue of land. Okay. That becomes a bone of contention because between the new settlers and the old owners of the land. Okay, and not surprisingly also, in all the settler colonies like Kenya, Nigeria, not Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, and Zimbabwe, Mozambique is another example, Algeria is another example, independence was won through armed struggle. In all of those, there was armed liberation movements. And the land question was at the basis of the whole struggle. So with Kenya, we had one of the earliest anti-colonial guerrilla movements. Ours was by the name of Mau Mau. And that was between 1952 and 1960, when the war was very active.
Can you just briefly talk about the significance of the founding president of Kenya, of Kenyatta?
Kenyatta is a very important figure in African politics, in Kenyan politics as well. And again, in my book, Dreams in Time of War, I talk about what his picture, his image meant to us as we were growing up. I so much wanted to meet him. I used to go to a place where, in Limuru town, where I come from, where he was supposed to come, and I would go there almost every, sort of week, expecting that he would turn up. He never did, because he was then also imprisoned by the British, But Kenyatta, remember Kenyatta worked with, Kenyatta was the leader of the anti-colonial movement in Kenya generally. Not necessarily Mau Mau, but the entire anti-colonial movement. He was in England for many years, between 1928 or 1930 to 1946, when he eventually returned to Kenya. In that time, he'd come into contact and become friends with people like Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Kwame Nkrumah, the great intellectuals of Pan-Africanism at the time. He was a member of the 1945, Pan-African Congress in Manchester, in England, which really generated, a lot of enthusiasm and put priority on African people organizing from Africa. And so the Kenyattas and Nkrumahs and others who were in England at the time all returned to their respective places. Nkrumah to Ghana, leading Ghana to independence in 1957, and Kenyatta to Kenya. But they traveled very different paths. In Kenya, a colonial settler state, Kenyatta was arrested in 1952, accused of being the leader of Mau Mau, and imprisoned, literally exiled within the same country for about 8 years, with 4 others, among them Ochieng Oneko and others. Now, but he became the symbol of African independence movement. He became the symbol of sort of defiance against the colonial state. But as a result of the agitation and war and everything else, he was eventually released in 1960 to become the first president of independent Kenya. Unfortunately, Kenyatta didn't live up to the expectations, okay? And under him, although there are some advances, because remember, independence was a very big thing for us, but the policies he followed did not necessarily mean empowerment of ordinary Kenyans and so on. The policies he started when he became president between 1963 and when he died in 1978 were carried over by a successor, Daniel Arap Moi, who, unlike Kenyatta, had actually worked closely with the British colonial state, even during the colonial days. And now, by one of those things, that happened during the Cold War and after, he becomes now the second president of the independent Kenya. And he, Daniel Moi, now intensifies repression and carries the whole thing from just personal rule of Kenyatta or the retained rule of Kenyatta and becomes a full-blooded dictatorship.
Kenyan author Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of the giants of African literature, talking about the anti-colonial movement in his country. Well, I also spoke with another star not normally associated with Kenyan independence. In fact, his great-uncle was Kenya's founding Prime Minister, Jomo Kenyatta. I'm talking about the guitarist Tom Morello of Rage Against the Machine. His newest band with Boots Riley is called Street Sweeper Social Club. I interviewed them both recently in our studio. Tom Morello talked about his own connection with Kenyan anti-colonialism.
My father's Kenyan. My parents met in East Africa. My great-uncle is Jomo Kenyatta, who was Kenya's first president. And my mom went there to teach. They have these I was from a tiny coal mining town in central Illinois, and somehow got the impetus to travel the world on her own, and visited, Germany, China, but ended up in Kenya, where she became part of Kenya's independence struggle. Met my father there, and my dad was part of Kenya's first United Nations delegation. That's why I was born in the United States.
So there are some similarities between you and President Obama.
Well, other than the fact that we're devastatingly handsome, half-black dudes with Kenyan fathers, white American mothers from Illinois who both went to Harvard, no, there's very little in common between us.
What do you think about that?
I mean, I thought I was the only guy. Like when he gave his breakout speech to the world at the Democratic Convention, I guess it was 6 years ago now, I really couldn't believe it, because he was basically reading my bio. I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. And now he's been on the cover of Rolling Stone more times than I have. So there's some envy in that.
What has been Kenyatta's influence on you?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Libertyville, Illinois, which is a very, I literally integrated the town. I was the first person of color to reside within its borders, and it's a district where Democrats don't even run. I mean, that's how conservative it is. And but within that very, at the time, exclusively white conservative, narrow conservative bastion, we had pictures of Kenyatta on the wall. We had, Kwame Nkrumah's books. There was, Che Guevara's guerrilla warfare manual was one of the things just sort of laying around that I was flipping through as a child. So the politics of my home were very, very different than the politics of the community, which I think when I got to the sort of the age of the teenage age of rebellion really helped hone my politics in a way that might not have happened in other circumstances.
Guitarist Tom Morello. His new band with Boots Riley is called Street Sweeper Social Club, and we will broadcast that full interview in the coming days on Democracy Now! As well, we will post online our interview with Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and we'll play it on Democracy Now! That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Shrufado Caduce, Armata, Angela Kamet, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hani Massoud, and Robbie Karen. Mike DeFilippo and Miguel Noguera, our engineers. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Julie Crosby, Nick Gilla, Hugh Grant, Jessel Noor, Vesta Godars, and to John Randolph, Karen Krug Meadows, Rockam Penny, Kellan Emerson. I'm Amy Goodman. Our website, democracynow.org. Thanks for joining us.